This is my Murray cultivator, 2 horsepower, 10-inch, and it has a Tecumseh, and the model number is TC300, and additionally it's called a TC2. So TC300, TC2, Tecumseh. And what I'm going to do today is show you the carburetor and the issues that I ran into. And I actually did quite a bit of research on the internet and referring to technical service manuals, and I think I have a lot of it addressed, and it actually clarified a lot of my confusion, because when I was looking for some advice on the internet about this particular unit, I was disappointed and confused. So first, let's get to the carburetor. I already took a lot of it apart and I identified my problem, but I want to show you specifically what to expect if you have a unit like this or a cultivator like this. This is the fuel tank, and that red thing there is the choke, and I'll show you how I took it off in just a minute. And it's a manual choke, this little lever right there. Force it up and down, it smoothly glides, by the way, you don't have to force it. So that's an open choke, and that's the closed choke. It comes right off. All you need to do is, there's a nut right there, and that's where this mounts, right there. And it's a 9mm nut. And then additionally, you have to go into the air box or the air cleaner and take these two off. There's 2 more nuts, and they are also 9mm. So 2 nuts, and they're right there, and there, right there. Those 2 holes, you take them off, and then you take the nut off there, and this thing slides right off, with the exception of the fuel line, which I'll address in just a minute. So a 9mm socket is all you need for that. These 2 are extended bolts and nuts, and they go right into the cylinder head, and they come off with a 1/4 nut or socket, and you simply unscrew them. And be very careful when you do this, because a lot of parts could potentially come dislodged. So that's what you're taking out. There's 2 of these. Here's the other one. Now, for all practical purposes, the carburetor is almost removed. There is one additional thing that you have to be concerned with, and that's this thing. It's the fuel line from the gas tank right here with this little clamp. But this thing right here, and I think they call it a fuel filler is the formal name, fuel fitting. And if you'll note mine right there, I had this thing in storage for a couple years, and I pulled it down. I wanted to use it. It's always been very reliable, and I started leaking fuel, and I tracked it back down to this thing right there, this plastic thing. And as you can see, it's cracked. So that's my issue. It's a relatively inexpensive piece. It's a couple dollars, and I have the part number, and I'll put that in the description of this video. Also, you note that the fuel line is really rigid, and I'm going to be replacing that as well. I think it's an 1/8 or maybe a 3/16. I'm not sure of the size. Anyways, continuing on. So taking the carburetor off, and you have to be very careful, because you're going to be addressing this too. This is the governor spring. I already took it off. It actually goes, the back end of it goes right there, and I'll show you what I'm referring to. Right there on that little piece of metal, and that is, here's the governor spring. Put it in my palm so you can see it. And one end has a little J-hook and the other one has a circular end. The circular end goes right onto that little mount, and then the back end, the J-hook, goes onto this air flap that goes into the shroud. And I'll take this off very carefully and I'll show you how it goes in. So you simply pull that out. Now be very careful with all these things here. So here's the carburetor, and before I progress on, I want to show you this governor spring. So the governor spring, once again, goes right here onto this thing. I have it mounted there, and then on this air flap, which goes into the shroud, there are actually two holes right there, and you probably can't see them, but there are two holes right at the base there. And make sure you note which one your spring goes into, and that little J-hook clips onto this. Now mine, it was the back one. There's two. Once again, there's one that is further this way and one further forward. Mine was this one, and the way they identify as to which slot or hole for that air flap your spring would go into, they actually spray painted the spring, and mine was black. So they say black, red, or pink goes into the number 2 slot, which is, once again, the one furthest in that direction. And then the number 1 slot, you can barely see it, is the one right behind it. Once again, mine is slot number 2, and that's where the J part of the hook goes into. And then just for reference, if you happen to have your spring that's orange or green, that's slot number 1. So once again, slot 2 is the one. Let's see if I can do this with one hand. So slot 2 is right there. It's the one on this side, and then slot 1 is the one, you can't see it because it's plugged with grease, but it's the one that goes in that direction. So mine's slot 2. Okay, so continuing on, now we've taken the carburetor off, but you have to be mindful of this. I'll get the governor spring out of the way for the time being. Right here, this is where a lot of confusion on the internet relating to this particular unit takes place, and I just want to talk about this. So this right here, first of all, you have a gasket. You have to remember that this gasket is required. Some people say that the plastic housing adheres directly to the carburetor, and that's wrong. I took mine apart very carefully, and this gasket is needed between the carburetor and this insulated spacer is what they're calling it. It's a piece of plastic. This thing is, depending upon which video you watch, it's pretty straightforward for me because I was very careful taking it apart. And you note when it comes off, there's a little slot in the back, and that's called a vacuum channel. Right there, it's a U-shaped slot. And mine is towards the engine. Once again, there's nothing on this side, you'll see. But on the back, there's that vacuum channel. And that is how the fuel travels. So if we put, you can see the indentation it put in my gasket right there. And in this gasket's adhered to the piece of aluminum here. So you can see that that is correct. It goes towards the engine. Some people say it faces that way. This particular cultivator, it faces the engine. And you'll see the little hole on this side. There's only one hole, and that is for the fuel to travel. So if you look at the carburetor now, once again, if we were to put it back on, you'll see that one hole right there. Only one hole. and that mates up with that vacuum channel. Once again, right there, that's the hole. It feeds into it, and then it goes through it and through that channel and goes into the engine. So you can see how that mates up. This is important because a lot of people had different opinions about that, but that's correct. So that primarily addresses everything that I found and clarifies a lot of components and parts. I do have part numbers for all this, and I'll put them in the description. I hope that clarifies any questions you may have. Once again, my particular unit, TC300 TC2, the vacuum channel faces the engine. It does not face the carburetor like some people say it might. Mine faces the engine. And then there's a gasket on top of this. And then the carburetor. Oh, and one more important part, and I found this to be interesting. So about this carburetor, I cleaned it and it's ready to be put back on, but I ran into an issue, and I just want to point it out. So this port right there, that brass port, I want to show you something. So right there, that brass port, if you take this off, there's a diaphragm in there, and this is part of the fuel pump. And if you take this off, there's a passage right there, and people like sticking thin wires or pins or whatever, cleaning it out. And if you do that for this particular passage, once again, that is right in here, and you pop it through, you think you did a good thing. Well, actually you didn't, because in there is a very, very small check valve, and right inside there, you can barely see it, believe me, it's there, and you don't want to damage or knock that out. It's a very small circular piece of membrane, and it goes up and down. It's a check valve, and you don't want to go in there and start poking a pin or a wire into that passage. You want to leave that alone. That's one thing that I found that was pretty interesting, because people like sticking wires and pins and everything else in there. And for that particular passage, I would strongly advise not sticking anything in there, because if you do and you knock that check valve out, you have to get a new carburetor. And this particular cultivator, it's pretty old, and you can't find a direct replacement carburetor for it. You can probably use one of the later models, but then you have to make modifications to the carburetor to get it to fit. So I hope this helps. If you have any questions, let me know.